All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mending the Fabric of Democracy, Teaching Civic Readiness. We're going to get going in a minute or so. My name is Leila Zubani from the Center for Educational Equity in Democracy Ready, New York. We're pleased to have you join us today, and as we explore one of the important elements of civic readiness, which is media literacy. Your input is very valuable, so please feel free to engage with one another and with the panelists in the chat box. If you do have specific questions for the panelists or the moderator, feel free to use the Q&A function where you have the option to submit your questions anonymously if you'd like. If you are directing your questions to someone in particular, be sure to indicate that before you send it in. These sessions will be recorded, so keep an eye out for an email. It's going to have instructions regarding how to access the recordings. And finally, at the end of the session, you'll have another opportunity to give your input through a survey that will pop up in the browser, and it'll also be in your emails. So if you could take some time to complete that survey, we would really appreciate it. I think we're going to go ahead and get started now. I'm going to start by playing a video for you all from Thomas Bailey, the president of Teachers College.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the opening of our webinar series, Mending the Fabric of Democracy, Teaching Civic Readiness. It would be hard to imagine a more timely topic. When I say that, I mean that the importance of civic education goes well beyond the sad fact that millions of Americans cannot name the three branches of government or their elected representatives. Several weeks ago, after the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, Stacey Abrams did not engage in hyperbole when she wrote in the Washington Post that our democracy had survived a near-death experience. I would even go so far as to suggest that the survival of our democracy depends on the revival and restoration of civic health. We cannot bridge the deep divides in the country and turn the corner towards a full recovery until we can all engage in mutually respectful debate and, if need be, disagreement, but from a baseline of agreed upon rules. The first of those rules, and fittingly, the focus of today's opening session, is the respect for truth and facts and the ability to distinguish fact from fiction. Without a respect for truth and agreement about basic facts, there can be no informed and productive discussion, debate, and deliberation. The events in Texas in recent weeks offer a stark example of what I'm saying. When the winter storm hit and the power grid collapsed, elected officials brazenly spread the myth that renewable energy was the culprit. They claimed that people were freezing in their homes because of the failure of sources such as windmills and solar power, which account for less than 10% of the energy generated in Texas. And they pointed the finger directly at the Green New Deal, as though legislation that was proposed 2 years ago and never enacted somehow forced Texas to stop relying primarily on fossil fuels and nuclear power. Of course, the real story behind this tragic catastrophe was that the power grid had not been winterized, despite many previous warnings, and continued to fail when demand peaked. What separates this disaster, even from something as awful as Hurricane Katrina, is that here you have dueling narratives about the causes and effects of what happened and about the roles and responsibilities of government. So, we can start the work of restoring our democracy to civic health by defeating the virus of fake news and media illiteracy through the power of civic education. I would like to add one additional point. There are those who would say that democracy itself has become a partisan issue, that the people calling for a restoration of civic values tend to be Democrats, liberals, and those on the left in general. But civic education is essential to the health of our democracy, and it is also practical. Employers across the nation, from the biggest companies to the smallest independent concerns, have been saying for years that they seek employees who can think independently, who can conduct critical analyses and devise alternative solutions, who can lead and work in teams. There's no better training to acquire those skills than learning to become informed citizens who can work together across and through their differences in order to address issues and challenges that touch on our lives. Education, racism, poverty, climate change, and threats to public health. So my hat is off to all of you who have gathered today to launch this valuable series. I particularly want to thank all of the speakers, our partners who have joined the Democracy Ready New York Coalition, and Michael Robel and Jessica Wolf of TC's Center for Educational Equity. And I look forward to hearing what our many speakers have to say. A final word. It will take all of us working together to nurse our democracy back to health. Making effective civic education an essential part of every school child's experience and civic literacy a fundamental skill is a crucial enterprise for New York and the nation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Tom. I'm Michael Robel, the Executive Director of the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College. And I'd like to say a few words about some of the factors that led to the interest of our center in these civic participation issues and the formation of the Democracy Ready New York Coalition that is co-sponsoring this webinar series with us. 18 years ago, in 2003, New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals, issued a major decision known as CFE versus State of New York that declared that all students in New York State have a constitutional right to the opportunity for a sound basic education. And the way they defined that right was particularly striking to me at the time, and it's particularly relevant to our discussion today. The highest court in our state said that every student in New York State has a constitutional right under the state constitution to an education that provides them the skills they need to function productively as civic participants capable of voting and serving on a jury. So the highest court thought this civic preparation is the essence of education. That goes back to our founding forefathers who wrote the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They all said the same thing. And I think it's of great significance that in the 21st century, our highest court is defining your right to education for all of you students out there. But over the last few years, I've been struck as I've traveled around the state to realize that very few students, very few parents, very few teachers know about this constitutional right. And perhaps more importantly, I've come to realize that although our highest court may think the essence of education is civic education, civic preparation, in fact, in our schools throughout the state, civics really has a low priority. A lot of reasons for that, and we'll discuss some of them perhaps later in the series. But I want to start on the positive upswing that's happened in the last few years. And one of the really important recent events was the fact that in 2016, the Board of Regents, our highest governing body in education in the state, submitted their ESSA plan to the federal government. That was a requirement to get Title I money into the state. And among other things, in that document, they made a very important statement, and that was they redefined what the outcome goals of education in New York State are. Now, previously, New York, like most other states, said that the outcome of a good education in New York should be that students are college and career ready. But beginning in 2016 in the ESSA plan, the regents declared that the outcome goals in New York State are broader, and students should be prepared for college, career, and civic readiness. So civic readiness has been advanced to the highest level of focus of the regents at this point. And the regents did something else in that plan. They said they were going to appoint a task force to help them understand what civic readiness means and what the state of New York has to do to really be providing this civic readiness to its students. So I'm very pleased to say that I was asked to take part in this task force. Some of the panelists you'll be meeting throughout this series also took part in the task force. That task force has done some good work. We've defined what civic readiness is in very robust terms. We've created a new state seal for civics for students who have done outstanding work in this area. We've talked about a new capstone project, an emphasis on capstone projects that schools are going to be encouraged to offer to their students. We've started down this path, but we know we've got a long ways to go, and we need to bring so many more voices and so many more people into this enterprise. And that's why we were really pleased that we got so much interest from organizations and individuals around the state when we started doing this work, that we formed the Democracy Ready New York Coalition. Now, Democracy Ready is really a path-breaking statewide coalition. Our membership is very diverse. I think you'll find most of the leading education organizations in the state are members of this coalition. Most of the leading civic organizations in the state are. In addition, we have representatives of researchers from higher education. We have a number of youth leaders. So what I can say to you is, it is really rare in New York, or quite frankly, in any other state, for so many people from the highest echelons of the education sector, from the civic sector, from the youth organization sector, from higher ed, to join together and deliberate on what do we need to do to advance education in the state of New York. And that's why we're so pleased that the coalition is sponsoring today's webinar, and in fact, the entire webinar series that, as I think you all know, is going to continue on every Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock throughout the month of March. And as you know, today's session will focus on media literacy. A week from today, the topic will be, how do we discuss controversial issues in the classroom? How do teachers deal with these contentious issues that are so important for kids to learn how to enter into civic discussions with people with differing views. On March 18th, we will focus on igniting civic action among young people. The youth emphasis on this, we'll have a panel of young people, a few older people on that panel. And our final wrap-up session on March 25th is a call to action. And during that session, we'll have some of the leading political figures in the state, including the Commissioner of Education and the chair of the Senate Education Committee, as well as teacher student representatives. It's going to be a very exciting culmination to the whole series. And as you'll see throughout these 4 webinar sessions, there'll be many teachers, students, advocates, all of whom come from our member organizations in the Democracy Ready New York Coalition. And in addition, we will have scholars, advocates, administrators, and public officials who are committed to advancing civic preparation in New York State, in addition to so many of our Democracy Ready New York Coalition members. So before I conclude these very brief remarks, I want to thank Teachers College. I want to thank our hardworking Center for Education Equity staff members, in particular, Jessica, Leila, and Labu, and others who have worked so hard to put this together. I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who has provided us the funding for this venture. And of course, I want to thank all our Democracy Ready New York members who are supporting this venture, our panelists, Margot Perman of Real Design Associates, and Jeff Heckelman, who was our public relations consultant, all of whom really volunteered their efforts in a great way. And my final responsibility, which is a very pleasant one, is I want to introduce Jenna Flanagan, who will be moderating this first exciting session on the critical topic of media literacy. And Jenna goes way back with her interest in news, in moderating, in reporting. She first knew she was destined for a career in journalism after following the weekly reports of the Muppet News Flash as a child. How many of us remember that one? In any event, in high school, she wrote for her student newspaper, and she attended a journalism class at SUNY New Paltz, which is her hometown. Jenna then went on to earn a BA in Communications and Journalism at Seton Hall University. In 1999, she took her first job in the business as a production assistant for 1010 Winds, which was one of the early all news stations, eventually working her way up to be an assistant editor. After a stint in an on-air position at WBGO, the Newark Public Radio station, Jenna spent 6.5 years writing, reporting, and producing All Things Considered for WNYC Radio in New York City. And as you know, All Things Considered is aired nationally through NPR. Jenna's had a hand in many other NPR productions. Since 2016, Jenna's been a full-time journalist and host of the WNET 13 news magazine, Metro Focus. So now I'm going to turn the discussion over to Jenna, who will introduce our panelists and begin today's media literacy conversation.
Michael, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So yes, as I was just introduced, I'm Jenna Flanagan, host of Metro Focus on 13 WNET here in New York. And so basically what we're going to start off with is one of the things that I think is so critical, not only to journalism, but to civic engagement, and especially this discussion. And that is a basic agreed upon fact. Now, our fact comes from the National Association for Media Literacy Education. And that is, what is the definition of media literacy? The National Association defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. In its simplest terms, that means media literacy builds upon the foundation of traditional literacy and offers new forms of reading and writing for people. Media literacy also empowers individuals to be critical thinkers, very important, and makers and effective communicators, as well as active citizens. So that is going to be our basic agreed upon fact. For myself as a journalist, I find this topic so critically important, mostly because most of my career has been spent in public media, as you just heard, between NPR, PBS productions, and nothing is quite as disheartening as getting comments from stories that we've worked on, or perhaps interviews that we've done, where people sort of assume that because of the station I'm working for, we automatically have a political slant. We work very, very, very hard not to do that. And yet so many Americans have come to just assume that that's normal and expected. So for this afternoon, we hope that the participants will get a lot out of this session. And so what we're going to be doing is information for everybody who's participating or listening to this about why media literacy is so important, especially now more than ever. So many people, of course, are getting their information, be it news or simply rumors, and I'm sure we'll get into that, from so many different sources at this point. It's getting more and more challenging for traditional news media to keep up with that. We'll also be discussing ideas and actions, steps that can help propel us to further develop better media literacy and ensure that this element of civic readiness is available to all New York students. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our various panelists. And so I'm going to start with Howard Schneider. Howard is the executive director of Stony Brook University's Center for News Literacy, the former founding dean of the university's School of Journalism, and the former editor of Newsday. Under his tenure as managing editor and then editor, the paper won 8 Pulitzer Prizes, 8. In 2007, Schneider developed the nation's first undergraduate course in news literacy, designed to teach students how to identify reliable news and information. In 2018, he and his colleagues began adapting the curriculum for a growing number of K through 12 school districts. So welcome, Howard Schneider.
Glad to be here.
Up next, we have Kelly Weatherby. Kelly is in her 17th year as a school librarian in the North Colonies Central School District. That's a suburb of Albany. I know because I used to work in the Capital District. Kelly works with high school students each and every day to educate them on the importance and skills necessary to become media literate. She's civically engaged members of the entire community up there. Kelly's a member of the Democracy Ready New York Coalition and as a co-director of the Capital Region Institute for Human Rights, an organization in its 7th year created to educate teens on current relevant issues impacting human rights and instructing young people on ways to immediately begin their advocacy work for the issues while they're still in school. Kelly, welcome. We are also joined by Numa Khan. She is a senior at Shaker High School in the North Colony School District with a love of politics, musicals, and Webinomics. And we can all ask her exactly what Webinomics are. As a science research student of 3 years, she has extensive experience sorting fact from fiction and is a devout believer in the phrase, knowledge is power. Amen to that. She aims to educate the public about inequalities, to mobilize others, and to produce change whenever possible. So welcome, Numa. We also have Chris Berry. Chris is the Director of Curriculum and Staff Development for Project Look Sharp, a media literacy initiative at Ithaca College that he co-founded in 1996 with Dr. Cindy Scheibe. Chris taught social studies, English, and media studies, and was a teacher coach at Democratic Public Alternative School in Ithaca for 40 years. He's an award-winning media literacy teacher, teacher trainer, writer, and co-author of the upcoming book, look for this, Teaching Students to Read the World, Media Decoding in Today's Classroom. So welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Jenna.
And we also have Linda Rosenthal. Linda is, and you probably know the name, she's an assembly member who represents the 67th Assembly District in New York, which includes the Upper West Side and parts of Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. First elected in 2006, she has passed more than 120 laws and has been a strong advocate for affordable housing and tenants' rights in New York State, women's rights, and menstrual equality. Yes, okay. Animal welfare, consumer protection, and she was the sponsor of the Child Victims Act when it becomes law after more than a decade of advocacy and is currently sponsoring legislation to expand media literacy education in schools. Assemblymember Rosenthal serves as the chair of the Assembly Committee on Social Services. That is quite the bio. Welcome, Assemblymember Rosenthal. And of course, some of you may not know, but off camera, we'd also like to welcome Leila Zubani. She is from the Center for Educational Equity, and she'll be monitoring the conversation going on in the chat. So we'd like to encourage everybody to interact in the chat box. I see several of you have already logged in with where you're coming in from and saying hello to each other, and that's great. Leila's going to ask people to share, as she already has, where they're from, their role, if you're a student, teacher, parent, librarian, administrator, legislator, etc. Feel free to share all of that in the chat. And so up first, I'd like to begin our conversation with the one and only Howard Schneider. And so Howard, if we could start, I'd like for you to lay out the state of media literacy. First of all, just where do you see the state of that, period?
So let me start by saying I want to focus like a laser beam on the civic function of media literacy, okay? And I want to basically define media literacy as a powerful vaccine to fight a public health emergency.
All right, that's completely sound. So then, if you consider all of the challenges that this public health emergency, the way you described it, are affecting it, what is it the most important first step that needs to be taken?
So let me try to define, if it's okay. I'm going to share my screen. I want to tell everybody a story, and I want to try to define what the public health emergency is, and then I'll address your question if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me do that. Let me share my screen. And let me tell everybody a story, and let's go back. We may not want to go back, but let's go back to the spring of 2016. And in the spring of 2016, a new Islamic center was being built. A library and center was being built in downtown Houston, Texas. And a Facebook group called Deep in the Heart of Texas, a group that advocated secession, that was very proud of Texas as an independent entity. They immediately told its thousands of Facebook members, we've got to stop the Islamization of Texas. Crucial, stop it. And they urged all of their members to show up downtown in Houston to protest the center. Well, guess what? Another group on Facebook called the United Muslims of America heard about this and said, this is outrageous. This is anti-American, and urged all of its thousands of members to go downtown to Houston, same day, Saturday, May 21st, and counter protest. And so both groups show up and they get into a confrontation and it escalates. So what do both groups have in common? Now, if we had time and we could have everybody raise their hands, I would ask that question. And when I ask that question to lots of people, they'll say, well, both groups mobilize their supporters via Facebook. And both groups were very emotional in their messaging. But here's what they really have in common. The Facebook Heart of Texas group is not run by anybody in Texas. And the United Muslims of America group is not run by any Muslims. These are both groups that were organized by Russians. And they were among the 3,000 posts on Facebook by Russian operatives to divide Americans on issues of gun control, on issues of immigration, on issues of race. And I don't tell you this to alert you to the problems of foreign interference in our elections. That's not the point. By the way, this is the news story about the confrontation. It doesn't come out until 2 years later that these are Russian fronts. This is why I tell you that story, because this is the culmination of that story. In the last 90 days before the election of 2016, this is a chart looking at the 20 most popular stories on the election that were produced by mainstream news organizations, respected news organizations. And it looks at the 20 most popular fake news stories, stories that were either totally fabricated or stories that came from hyper-partisan blogs. And I want you to look at the two lines, and what happens as we get closer to election day. More Americans engaged with, shared, read, acted on information that was either false or partisan than fact-based information, choosing the most powerful person in the world. And I'm not talking about whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican or you're an independent or you're a conservative. This is how we were making a decision in 2016. And I wish I could tell you things were better. But the German Marshall Fund found out that, in fact, this past election cycle, there was more misinformation on social media than there was 4 years ago, despite all of the efforts by the platforms to do something about it. It's not only about politics, excuse me. Let me go back. We know what's going on with COVID. We know this is a matter of life and death. We know in New York State, for instance, 25% of New Yorkers, this may be changing, say they don't plan to take a shot. And there's some good reasons why people might be hesitant, right? They may be worried about side effects and may distrust the people giving them the shot. But a percentage of those people report that they still believe that the vaccine is a way of the government basically inserting a chip into their bodies to monitor their behavior. Other people say it's a Bill Gates plot, by the way, to cut down on population growth. We've got people acting on information that's not reliable, that's a matter of life and death, and it affects all of us, because if people are not taking that shot, that's affecting us. So there's a context for all of this. I just want to step back for a second. And the context is we are living through the most profound communications revolution in 500 years. Not since the printing press have we seen such transformative change in the way we are spreading, the way we are consuming, the way we are making decisions about information. And this revolution is not going away, and it's not dependent on who the president is, and it's not going to fade the way, God willing, COVID fades. It's here, and it's profound. And the question is, are we ready for it? Are students ready for it? And if not, what do we have to do to prepare them? One little thing, let me go back to the 4 challenges for a second, okay?
I was gonna say, please, if you could wrap it up quickly, because we do have to move on.
Absolutely. 4 challenges: too much information, getting it too fast, hard to know what's authentic, have to overcome our own bias. I'll get right to the heart of the question. Are our students ready? So Stanford University has done the most extensive studies of whether students in America are ready for these changes, whether they can judge the reliability of news and information online. They have given a cross-section of students exercises. This is one quick one. You sent them to a website, 2 stories about climate change in America. And they said to them, both on the Atlantic Monthly homepage, which one would you choose to make a reliable decision about climate change? The nature of the problem. High school students in America looked at these 2 stories. One by a science writer, the other a sponsored content post by Shell Oil. 70% of American high school students said they would rely on the sponsored content post by Shell Oil.
Well, Howard, that is a lot to digest and some very troubling information, but I want to thank you for your presentation. We do have to move on to our next panelist, but I'm sure that's a subject we'll be coming back to.
Sure, I apologize for going on, but I wanted at least to define the emergency for everybody and the urgency.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you so much for it. Up next, I'd like to invite Chris Sperry into the conversation. Chris?
Great.
And I'd like to start with, I guess, even though building sort of on what we just heard from Howard, but why media literacy?
I am going to share my screen, if I can, and go right to addressing that question, why media literacy? And I'm going to start very broad and big and going back to take Howard's kind of immediate crisis situation and rewind. This is me as a young, privileged white boy. My dad was mayor of my town growing up outside of New York City, a lot of economic privilege, but I hated school. And I hated school because I had a spelling challenge, a form of dyslexia. I had a hard time keeping track of the words. And because of that, school was a place where I felt stupid, and nobody wants to spend 6 hours a day in a place where they feel stupid. But I loved communication. I loved ideas. I loved morality. I loved themes. And when I would go home and watch television and get into my comic books, I loved communication. But school was not a place that worked for me. In high school, partly because of that privilege, with a Super 8 camera in my hand as a surfer boy in the Jersey Shore, I was able to make surfing films and get a sense of myself as a communicator, and found myself in college studying filmmaking, and then connected with the radical alternative schools movement of the 1970s and found myself teaching film and media production in a small alternative school in 1978, where I stayed for over 40 years, teaching a broad range of students from very academic families, Cornell and Ithaca College faculty, and students whose parents and grandparents had dropped out of school before high school. And in that context, the textbook didn't work. The printed world didn't work. And because of my own experience, I could see the brilliance in those non-academic students. So I began to bring in 16mm movies and posters and paintings and records at that point. and taught history and English language arts through those different mediums. That leveled the playing field and empowered all of my students to really become engaged in learning that content. And while we were doing that, we began to ask questions. Who made this? What's included? What's left out? Who might benefit? Who might be harmed from this? Is this a credible source or a not credible source? How do my own biases influence how I understand these different media messages? So we were layering in critical thinking and media analysis as we were teaching history, social studies, later science and health at all different kinds of levels. That ultimately led to the founding of Project Look Sharp under the leadership of Professor Cindy Scheib, where we responded to teachers by providing them with lessons that teach core content in all different subject areas and grade levels. Over 500 free lessons now online for doing that work. But rather than saying more, I'm going to demonstrate a tiny little example of that. Let's say you're a 9th grade social studies class. We're beginning a unit on the Middle East, and we're going to start with this text, with this document, the very beginning of the film Aladdin. And I'm going to ask you to add into the chat, what are the messages about the Arab world in this very brief text that you're going to see now? Messages about the Arab world, add into the chat if you would. And that's it. That's the text that we are going to begin with now. If you can add into the chat, what are messages in that tiny little piece of media, that text? Messages about the Arab world. What are messages about the Arab world? Mystery. Thanks, Shira. Mysterious. Look at that. All 3, 4, 5. I would hone down on that as a teacher. I would immediately probe in. What's your evidence in the document about mysterious? And get students to give discussions of color and of sound and of the way that the smoke disappears and their own connotations about that. And we would begin to unpack. I might show a little bit more of that Aladdin introduction, which is actually quite racist, and unpack that a little bit and have students ask the question to students, are there stereotypes here? Have them identify the stereotypes that exist in this, but then probe around, well, what's the purpose of this clip for 9th graders? Is Disney intentionally trying to communicate stereotypes, and then get into the issue of Disney's purpose to make money as a piece of entertainment? Why would they use stereotypes in the process of doing that in terms of exoticism and mystery and entertainment, to understand the concepts that stereotypes may be perpetuated, not of intent necessarily, but it still has the same impact and effect. A core aspect of what we would want them to understand as 9th graders as they're entering into a unit on the Middle East. So these kinds of questions overlaid into the textbooks we use in class, into all different kinds of media documents, can integrate media literacy throughout the curriculum in all different subject areas. Media literacy can be a model, a pedagogy, a methodology for engaging all students in a student-centered way that is question-based, that is objectives and standards-driven, that teaches students to reflect on their own thinking, their own confirmation biases, and that engages all students by tapping into their meaning making. When the founding fathers created democracy in this country for a select few, they knew that literacy was going to be at the core, learning to read and learning to write. They also, some of them, and in different states in this country, made sure literacy was not accessible to all people, because literacy is power. We need to bring literacy to all students across New York State through inquiry, through questioning, through reflection, throughout the curriculum in all different subject areas at all different grade levels, developing these habits of critical questioning across the curriculum, because not only is it what it means to be a citizen, not only what does it mean to help empower our students, but what it means to be a human being who participates in reading and writing the world. Thanks, Jenna.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, before I let you go, I'd like to bring Howie back on to the into the conversation and sort of ask, which I'm sure so many people in the chat are probably wondering, what kind of challenges do educators face when presenting this kind of information to the classroom, especially when you consider so many kids are probably coming from households or communities where everything can be seen in a very partisan way?
One of the things that's really important, Jenna, is creating a curriculum where there are common definitions and vocabulary, the descriptions that allow students to talk across their differences. I got an email this week from a coordinator. We are now working with 3 school districts on Long Island where every student in the school district takes elements of news literacy. And she said to me, Howie, I could not have taught what happened on January 6th. And I could not have taught the election, this past election, without news literacy curriculum materials that allowed our students to understand that there are definitions of fairness and bias. One last thing, Jenna. Superintendent in this school district wrote to the parents after January 6th, telling the parents that they were going to deal with this in the classroom. And that's very provocative. Many teachers are gun shy, and they were going to deal with it because they had a media literacy curriculum that enabled the students to talk about it in a productive and constructive way.
Okay, Chris, any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I want to add, in addition to specific media literacy curriculum, and in addition to that, we need to give our teachers the training and the resources to integrate questioning about media across the curriculum in all different subject areas, because we know we need our students to have the habits of questioning, the habits of thinking, and habits come with repeated use in different contexts at different times. So in addition to focused media literacy, news literacy curriculum, we need teachers to be trained, have professional development, have the resources needed at all different grade levels and at all different subjects to repurpose all media forms for critical questioning and analysis in the classroom.
All right, well, gentlemen, thank you to both of you. Up next, we're going to play a short kid-led, if you will, video clip from Democracy Ready New York member Inquiring Minds that illustrates the challenges we all have with decoding and, of course, trusting media. And then after that, we're going to hear from our school librarian, media specialist, and a high school student who will share some of the concrete classroom tools and experiences in media literacy education.
All right, I'm going to show you one last headline. Now I'm going to read you an excerpt from this article. In the headlines, I call the climate change industry a hoax. That's because on any objective level, it is. I don't mean that all the scientists and businesses and politicians promoting it are abject liars, just most of them, even if it means that in order to keep earning their living, they have to be dishonest with themselves about something they know in their hearts not to be true. I would like to start off with David. How do you know if you can trust the source? What stands out to you?
Yeah, that angers me. It's so opinion-based, and the opinion is very toxic, and yeah, that's all I can really say.
All right, Madison.
I'm gonna take a deep breath. First of all, the headline says the hoax that cost us $4 billion a day. That I'm not even gonna get into. How do you even know exactly how much money it costs, and why? And if it did cost us money, why didn't you put that in your article? But 2, why is there polar bears on ice next to the Brooklyn Bridge? That is what got me upset. That has to be fake. It has to be cropped and photoshopped because ice and polar bears are in the north. We are not in the north. I don't even know what we are in anymore because my mind is confused on why there is polar bears and ice in a picture with the Brooklyn Bridge and a body of water.
All right, to get a little more back on track, Madison, could you just explain in terms of, do you trust the source, and then give an explanation as to why?
I don't trust this source. I don't trust this source at all. Like David said, it is a toxic opinion. They were trying to manipulate you into thinking and to not trusting people in our government, like the congressman or the Senate.
David, while I was reading the source, what specifically made you believe that it wasn't something that could be trusted or wasn't like a source that could be completely taken at face value?
Well, a lot of it is like very subjective and opinion based. Like the author said, like a majority of politicians are lying to the population in order to further benefit themselves. Especially when it comes to climate change, many people are telling us of that to further their own personal agenda.
All right, well, that was quite the video. Those kids are definitely after my own heart, but I'd like to bring in Kelly and Numa to the conversation. And Kelly, I'm going to start with you. How do you foster, I guess, media literacy development in the classroom?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. It is something that takes repetition, and I think both Howie and Chris mentioned that it's constantly building on those skills over time. And what I would like to do is just take a few minutes to kind of bring you through what we think media literacy looks like right now, and hopefully it'll give people a sense of what we do today. So if you look at our I'm going to start out by just talking a little bit about what it is for me personally. I'm in a secondary school. I am in a large suburban high school, and so it's about 2,000 students. And so that's going to be my perspective as I kind of talk about what my day-to-day is. I put a quote down here on the bottom because it comes from Dr. Barbara Stripling. She's one of the premier voices in information fluency curriculum in our state. She has written the information fluency continuum and updated it again in 2019. And the reason I mention it is because she talks about being both critical consumers and creators. And I believe Howie mentioned that as well, because students are creating as much as they're consuming the information. So we hopefully have to get to the point that, they're taking those steps to be sure that what they're sharing is in fact quality verified information. So we'll talk about what does media literacy education look like. I'm going to kind of go over what I think are 3 important strategies. And really those 3 they're sort of universal, but in some cases, a couple of them are particularly important based on the kinds of issues that Howie brought up. We're living in that time where students are bombarded, and it is kind of a point in history that we have to take it on and help these students be prepared as they head out into the world. And then I'm going to turn it over to Numa so that she can talk about what it's like on her end as a student. So just to give you a sense of what media literacy looks like in the classroom, we have our instruction at a secondary level is always a collaborative process. We are always working with content area teachers. Chris talked about having, different subject-specific areas reinforcing these skills. We do that. The teachers come into the library and they are putting together some sort of inquiry-based project. And now we take that project and we try to bring them through whatever appropriate skills, media literacy skills are applicable to that particular project. It's a huge amount of information, quite honestly, that we try to get across to them. And I don't have, quote unquote, a library class. So I'm kind of, it comes when it comes. And Numa will talk about her experience as a student and whether or not, some students are in classes where teachers come to the library a lot and they receive these skills reinforced continually. Some students come in and, on a very irregular basis because they just happen to have teachers that, do more in the classroom. So I guess that's part of the problem that we have at this point. But one of the most important things that we have to do in putting across all of this information is to come to have the students understand that we need to come to a point where we all have a shared set of facts. And we're not there right now, right? Everyone has their own reality. And so we're trying to teach students that,
you could only see who's speaking.
Okay, okay.
We need to debunk the Are we okay? Okay, so we need to be able to give those students the skills to kind of debunk those conspiracy theories where we have those Facebook posts like Howie showed us. You know, they need to be able to have the ability to kind of do the legwork to get to knowing that they're not real, that they were in fact a Russian bot, that there is no such organization. So that's the type of skills that we try to teach students on a regular basis. I'm going to just talk about 3 specific skills that I think are really important today. And one of the first one is just to slow down. And that means if you're doing a research project and you're doing a Google search and you come across some information, slow down, read it over, think about what you're reading. If you're home and you're on your phone and you come across a social media post that makes you feel sort of excited and you have a strong emotional response, don't quickly reshare, repost because it's something that's really exciting. I try to talk to students about just taking a breath, step back, think about what it is that you're looking at. Take a beat to sort of maybe do that extra step of checking out where is this information from and who's actually promoting it. Is it the truth? And do you really want to be associated with furthering this information out into the internet? Second thing, seems really basic, but it's not as obvious to everyone. And even adults that I talk to, being able to distinguish that this is an opinion piece, someone is really out here strongly promoting an opinion, and then we have real journalistic standards that are followed by reporters. And taking the time for students to understand the difference when they come upon this information is essential, because what'll happen is we have a legacy paper like a New York Times or a Washington Post, and someone sees an editorial from there and it isn't an opinion that they might agree with. So that student immediately thinks it's not a good paper, because but it really isn't a reporting issue, it's an opinion issue. And then the last piece, which is probably the most important piece, is what we call lateral reading. And that is where you come across information and maybe you're not sure exactly what it is that you're reading, and you need to find out a little bit more. So instead of doing what we used to tell students to do, which was, oh, go to the about page or that sort of thing, now we're saying, no, you need to open another tab and you need to see who this organization is. Who are the people associated with this organization? If you're having a hard time doing that, you open up another tab. Maybe you do something like go to a Wikipedia page, see who the principals are behind this organization. Open a tab to find out, is anyone else saying the same thing that this group is saying? So those 3 basic skills of slow yourself down, understand if it's an opinion or if it's actual straight up reporting, and take the time to do that cross-check verification through the lateral reading. Probably the 3 most important skills I can pass along to students right now. So what I would like to do is kind of pass it over to Numa Khan, who's going to spend some time talking about what it's like for her as a student at Shaker High School. And Numa, you're there?
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Weatherby. Yes, as a student, I feel that for some of us, media literacy training begins way too late, and it's often not updated for the modern world and its current obstacles. For example, we are nearing a voting age. How will we utilize skills in order to form our own opinions and understand current events so that way we can engage in civic participation? Additionally, according to Common Sense Media in 2019, 78% of teens ages 13 to 17 say it's important to follow current events. But how can we do so without strong media literacy skills? Next slide, please. Through a quick convenience sample poll I had taken with some classmates, I had asked them to correctly define media literacy, reading laterally and reading vertically. Given the small percentages, one could assume that we don't know most of these phrases. However, in skills-based questions I had asked them, there are mentions of cross-referencing and cross-checking, suggesting that we do know some of these concepts. Not all of them, but some of them However, the language being used may not be the friendliest to us because we have not had this education from a young age. Next slide, please. And speaking of the concepts that we do know, there are definitely things that I wish I had been taught in school, such as strategies to deal with sensationalized information. We are taught from a young age. Politicians tend to be experts at policies and bills that are on the floor. How do we, yet we may have issues of them giving wildly different interpretations of what the policy will be like for the average person. How do we decide who to believe? Just as Mrs. Weatherby had mentioned, also being able to check the credentials of the author, not just the content in an area of an article. Next slide, please. Additionally, my generation tends to use more digital sources. Yes, I had learned so much about print sources, but I rarely use them. I wish I had known more about the value of databases along with Googling, so that way it would become one of my first instincts to do. I wish I had known more about interpreting pictures and videos. And finally, I wish that we had a continued education in media literacy throughout elementary to high school. Because in elementary school, I was taught to just look at the about page, but now that is outdated information. I wish that I had learned these updated skills so that way I could properly be prepared for the world. Next slide, please. It is important to note, I am from a well-resourced school, and therefore I'm a rather atypical student. Because I had resources such as specialized classes, I was able to have all these things that I wish I had known answered for me. And therefore, I can do all of this and more. But how can we expect every student in New York State to be able to do so if we do not have the proper resources, if we do not have the curriculum for it? Thereby, I would love to see a proper standardized curriculum for all students in New York State to be able to do the same skills that I can.
Well, that was quite a case that you laid out for why there needs to be a standardized curriculum and why more students need more access. And our next panelist, I'd like to welcome Assembly Member Rosenthal, who perhaps can address some of these issues that you very well and very beautifully brought up. Assemblymember, you've been advocating for media literacy for quite some time now. What are your thoughts on what you heard from Numa about what needs to be done, resources, and perhaps engaging students at a younger age before they get to high school?
Okay, well, thank you. As you said, I'm Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal. I represent the Upper West Side in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, and I'm chair of the Committee on Social Services. And I'd like to thank you all for this wonderful presentation. And I thank the educators and students. Yes, I was listening, and I was always, when I hear kids her age, I think I could never have done that in when I was her age. I mean, really, this generation is so much more informed and engaged than mine, and I really think it's great. But that's even more why we need guidance.
Speaking on what you were saying about people's information and knowledge about levels of government, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your legislation in regards to
Okay,
media
absolutely.
literacy.
Yes, absolutely. I have bills that I'm working on with the coalition that would help New York State actualize a media literacy curriculum. So one bill would create a council of experts to conduct a study of the status of media literacy education in our schools. The group would be appointed by the commissioner of the state education department, the regents, experts in media literacy, including educators and parents. And this group would study the media literacy resources currently available in school districts and make recommendations based on the survey on how to increase or whatever they find. The second would require a library media specialist in each school, from elementary all the way to high school. The specialist would be responsible for implementing the media literacy curriculum. And we know that not only does every school not have a library media specialist, many schools don't even have libraries. So this is a vital component of the package, but an uphill battle because resources are always scarce. Then we have a bill that will require library media specialists to complete professional development in media literacy. And this would include culturally sensitive training in how to provide professional development in media literacy to teachers of all grade levels, and how to integrate media literacy into all components of their curriculum. And then we have a last one, will create a set of basic statewide standards in media literacy for students in grades K through 12. And this bill calls on the regents to ensure that media literacy is taught in those grades, and it provides guidance on what the standards should be. And so it goes on to define what media literacy is, the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication, use media, and encompasses the foundational skills that lead to digital citizenship. And it further defines digital citizenship as a diverse set of skills related to current technology and social media, including the norm of appropriate, responsible, and healthy behavior. And it focuses on empowering learners to use online resources, applications, and spaces to improve communities and curate a positive and effective digital footprint. And listening to the student, Tanuma, she could have written some of these bills, because what she was talking about is exactly what is needed in our schools, in our society, and certainly a curriculum that is in every school from grades K through 12.
Well, Assemblymember Rosenthal, I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we are going to have to leave it there, because we're going to now move into our full conversation with all of the panelists. So I'd like to welcome everyone back into the conversation. And I'd like to start off with the general question of, what do you see as what's needed to bring opportunities for more people, students and adults alike, to become media literate, but especially students in every school throughout the state? And since we started with Howard, I'm going to go back to you and just bring you in on what your thoughts are of what's needed.
Well, I think what we need first is leadership that's bold and moves in a quicker, more transformative way. For example, I would like to see the Board of Regents in New York require media literacy as a graduation requirement in New York State. They are now reviewing the graduation requirements. Why not make that a core competency for graduation? That by itself would drive a tremendous amount of activity. Two, they could require that all future teachers in New York State, in order to be certified, take X number of hours in news literacy, or media literacy, I should say, no matter what the grade and what the discipline, to guarantee that the next generation of teachers are armed with these kind of skills. Third, they could provide lots of opportunities for current teachers, incentivize them to take training so that we have teachers everywhere in the state who are up to speed and how they can introduce this in the classroom. So I think what the Assemblyman is suggesting is good, but I think it's too incremental, and I think we need to be bolder and a bit more transformative in moving forward. Technology moves very quickly, Jenna. Education moves slowly. The political process, as you know, as well as I do, moves slowly and deliberately, and I don't think we can afford to wait a long time for these things to happen.
Well, Assemblymember Rosenthal, just your thoughts quickly on, is there an appetite for this legislation that you've presented in Albany, or do people feel as though there's just bigger fish to fry right now, and perhaps they're not really focused on media literacy? Do you still have the Assemblymember? Okay, well, with that then, if we no longer have her, actually, I'd like to spin that question sort of to the rest of the panel. And Chris, I know this isn't specifically your area of expertise, but I think that's a very important question, is that if we're talking about creating a statewide standard, but there isn't really an appetite for that, how do educators then begin to navigate that? Because now we're talking about differences from school to school, from town to town, municipality to municipality. You know how it works.
So I want to say, I think there's a tremendous appetite on the part of educators to do what's right by kids. I know that in all of the work and time. And we know as educators that right now, in this time period in history, the issue of how we figure out what's true in the world and how we help our students to figure out what's true. It's an ancient goal of education and focus of education, and it's more true now than ever before. So I think there is tremendous appetite. I think teachers need training. They need leadership. That's where I think the role of librarians is so essential. And some of the policy proposals from Democracy Ready New York that Linda Rosenthal spoke to are moving us in the right direction to help give librarians the training, the background support to be leaders within each of their schools. But I'll mention one other thing that hasn't been talked about at all, and that is connected to research done by Kahn and Boyer in 2016 about how high school students assess what's true and not true in the media. And what they discovered is that students who are very well informed, who have a lot of facts, who know a lot about politics, are no better able to identify misinformation and what's true than students who do very poorly in school and don't understand a lot. Pumping out more facts and more information doesn't necessarily allow students to assess truth. One of the key factors that does is when we teach our students to reflect on their own thinking, to reflect on their own biases, to understand when they're skewing facts and information because of their own perspective and point of view, to discredit information that may otherwise be true. So if we really truly want all students to be better truth seekers, we must teach across the curriculum students to reflect on their own thinking, starting in kindergarten and first grade. What do you feel about that? And why do you think you feel about that? And how is it different than other people in your class? And how might it reflect different points of view and perspectives? So I think that's another critical component that we must bring to media literacy education and professional development for teachers and librarians.
Well, Kelly, your perspective, what role can perhaps parents play in all of this? I mean, definitely Chris made some excellent points about, things that educators could be doing, especially at an earlier age, but is there a role for parents in this as well? Oh, Cal, I think you're on mute.
I got it. I'm on mute. I do think there's a role for parents because, a collaborative effort with teachers and parents and district leaders and parents could go a long way toward encouraging them to kind of work with their young children. The problem we have is that the parents themselves may not have the skill set. Because as Howie said, this is moving so fast. The technological changes are just continually changing so that we don't necessarily, have parents that have all of the skills. So maybe, as a community, we do continuing ed programs in schools and we bring in families in the evenings and we go through some of these skills to get both the students and the parents together learning about some of these basic media literacy skills. I think that's a way of and I also think one of the risks, and I do it myself, I've got a daughter in her early 20s and, she's very, what I would call technologically savvy. She can work a device and load up a program and do all kinds of really cool things on a computer, but she doesn't necessarily have the skills to do the analytical work that is required when she's reading all of these posts online. So I think if parents kind of had more of an awareness that yes, their children are technologically engaged, but not necessarily as savvy as they might think.
So Jenna, can I interrupt just jump on that point to say that
sure.
In developing models, I mentioned earlier that we at our center are working with 3 school districts that we call lighthouse districts that are modeling this starting in the 6th grade through 12. And one component, they're all required to develop a complementary program for the community and parents. So last night I was on a program in which the parents were invited to do a workshop. So in many ways, the schools can teach the public as well as their students. I have students who tell me I go home and have to tell my mother not to send that email because she hasn't verified it yet. So, you know, we have a generation in which the younger people are going to teach the older people, but the schools are vehicles to teach the community as well as students.
Well, listen, thank you for all of our panelist members. We'd like to now open up some of the questions to the chat. And I'm looking now into some of the questions that we have. And up first, one of the ones that I'm seeing, actually, I'm getting one right now, I believe, in real time. And the question is, if I can read this correctly, okay. How does a person's political viewpoint affect their perception of what media literacy means in practice? That is an excellent point. Do people on the left and people who identify as Republican, perhaps on the right or conservative, have different takes on critical thinking and evaluation of information? That is a wonderful question. I open that up to the panel. Does anyone want to take that? Because that's a really good question.
I could jump in. Our critical thinking tends to be really strong when we are looking at things we disagree with. We can pick out, oh, wait a minute, we ask all sorts of questions. I don't think that that's accurate. I had read something really different than that. Where did they get their sourcing? But when we listen to and watch and hear things that fit our biases, our point of view, we tend to think that's pretty right, that's good. Yeah, we don't tend to ask those same kinds of questions unless we train students to recognize that reality, that that's what we do with information, in which case students can get to be onto themselves. So if I'm conservative and I watch Fox News and I know that, then I might be more critical saying, well, I'm just accepting this, or vice versa. If I'm listening to Democracy Now! And I'm a lefty, I'm realizing I'm not questioning it in the same kind of way. So being onto ourselves and thinking about how we shift information, how we tend to have weak sense critical thinking about things we agree with, is critical for our students to really begin to be reflective. And my last comment is that I think across the political spectrum, the research that we've done on people's evaluation, Republican and Democratic aligned, on, for instance, media materials we've created on presidential campaigns, they both think this work is really, really essential to be done. And for the same reasons. Republicans and Democrats both tend to say, well, the media is skewed and biased against my point of view from the other side. Therefore, if students tend to think critically about the media, they'll understand how biased it is on the left or the right. So I think there's actually a lot of support for across the board for people to think critically about bias in the media.
I think it's very important, Jenna, if I could jump in very quickly. This is a potential barrier for the introduction of this material because there are parents who are suspicious that somehow we're trying to inoculate or inject some kind of political spin on what their students are consuming. So the messaging by the schools to the parents are crucial. In these school districts, I keep coming back to, on open school night, all of the social studies teachers explain to the parents what media literacy was, what its goals are, what they're trying to accomplish. And that went a long way to building support on the part of parents for what was going on. This is politically agnostic. It's not telling people what to think, it's telling them how to think. And I think that goes a long way and it's an important component.
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent point, Howie. Propaganda is an incredible drug. But moving on, we also have another question. I believe it's from Michael, who is referencing a scholar, I believe Ezra Klein, who's argued that more and better media literacy education may help a lot less than people think. Is that right or is that wrong? And if it's right, what are the implications? What else might be needed? And so Kelly, since you work with kids, I'll start with you.
I guess I can't imagine that it would help less. I'm trying to think about in what way he's explaining it. Maybe if we go back to Chris's point that, you know, if they're still not evaluating and critically thinking about the information, if they're sort of constantly in that little information bubble and never getting out of it, I suppose, you know, making them more aware of where the sources are coming from. But if done well and if done right, And if it's something that's done from pre-K to grade 12, what needs to be done is for this to become second nature. It's just what kids do. And, you know, one of the, as I talked about the information fluency continuum that I was referencing from Barbara Stripling, her whole continuum looks at, you know, a series of essential understandings that come about through just building task upon task, or skill upon skill. And that's how we get to the point that by 12th grade, our students are leaving and fully capable. So I completely disagree. I mean, I'm going to, you know, I think, yeah, there could be an unintended consequence, but if we do it right, if we are thoughtful in our curriculum, I think it can only be a positive to our society and essential. You know, as I say, you know, you wouldn't want your student leaving high school not being able to read or to do some basic math skills. You know, we need students to be completely equipped. And so it's no different.
I mean, the one danger is, Jenna, that we don't want our students to become cynics. We want them to be skeptical thinkers. And we don't want them to believe that they can't trust anything or they can't believe in anything. We need them to believe reliable news and to act on it as much as they can, be able to discount what's not real. And I worry sometimes that if we are teaching them about all of the things that they can't trust, that they won't believe anything. And that's a danger I think we have to avoid.
You know, I'm sorry, what?
I just want to add one more thing about Klein's argument, and that is that there is good research that he quotes that just showing students other points of view and perspectives doesn't necessarily change their perspective. In fact, sometimes it reinforces their perspective. But there's other good research to show that when students are then asked to reflect on how they are evaluating those sources, that metacognition I spoke to, that can really lead to change. So it's not just showing them different points of view, it's getting them to reflect on how they interpret the credibility of different points of view and perspective and to reflect on their own thinking.
This next question, and I want to specifically ask this to Numa, since you were the person who's probably most recently taken a standardized test in school. We have a question from Susan who's asking, can testing companies be brought into the fold to incorporate media literacy into their test questions? And I'm wondering, from your perspective, are some of the lessons that you've learned over the past few years, would they be things that would fit into a standardized test?
What an excellent question. Thank you for asking it, Susan. For example, if I were to take the SAT, part of the essay section of it, although is optional, asks you to interpret the speaker's message, the speaker's tone, how they are portraying the message, what types of underlying messages that the author is trying to give you in a written document that you then analyze and write an essay about. So I would say that it is there to an extent, but I would also say it is rather basic level, and that it could encourage, testing companies could encourage further skills which will be tested upon in their exams, but then it is a question of, as standardized tests for some colleges, for example, become less dependent upon, perhaps testing companies may not end up being the only source we should be using to encourage students to have an increased knowledge in their evaluation skills.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody want to add in? No? Okay. All right. So then moving on, I did want to sort of build on that thought though, and ask, is there a way to handle something like that where you're able to push back against perhaps someone? What we see a lot now is that anytime certain opinion writers, if you will, or op-ed writers will get criticism against something that they've written, it immediately becomes an issue of, well, you're trying to silence me. Your criticism isn't fair. It's not right. And they get a lot of people really riled up and emotional and either on their side or against them. And suddenly you find two sides arguing not about the issue at hand, but about whether or not this person is being silenced. How do you teach students to not get caught up in the circus sometimes that the media can also engage in?
I guess I would say in working with students, you know, not that opinion pieces are important and they're you know, a vital part of you know, the news, but that they understand that you know, it is just that. It is an opinion. Take it in, understand it, and you know, let that be part of what you learn about that particular topic. The worst thing we can have, and that's part of more like a digital citizenship, is, you know, the cancel culture and the whole idea of, hey, you know what, I don't like that, I don't like what you said, and you know, to start getting online and making comments that are not directly related to the topic. So we do teach that with students, that when you're looking at something and if it sparks an emotional response and you want to engage in a conversation, that's fine, because that's kind of like our new town square, you know, out there in the, you know, Twitterverse or on Instagram. But make sure that, you know, when you're doing it, you're a thoughtful contributor to the conversation. That's how I would, you know, and talk to students about it.
Oh, wait, I see some hands. Numa?
Thank you. If I may also weigh in, I would argue we should be given some credit. We can recognize the fact that the topic of the conversation, maybe in the comment section of a post, has changed, but we just need to encourage people my age to slow down, take a minute, realize what emotions are being manipulated in ourselves to want to respond a certain way, to let us get off topic, and to perhaps even encourage analysis of the original discussion to bring people back onto track and to encourage other people to stop and realize what is happening and go back to the original concern.
All right, well, unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. I could continue this conversation. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us. You guys were absolutely great with profound insights on the subject of media literacy and, of course, how to best communicate that to students in classrooms. I'd also like to let everyone know to keep an eye out for a follow-up email with resources and information about how you can take action. I'm also going to say that if you'd like to join us again, next week's session is going to be discussion of controversial issues when classrooms are contentious. I think that's also incredibly important. That's going to be March 11th at 4 to 5:30 p.m. Again, thank you to everybody. And I guess one last shameless plug is that if you want to slow down and get more in-depth information, public media never hurts. So that's my final plug, but thank you to everyone and thank you for joining us for this incredibly important conversation.